In the bustling heart of a shopping mall, where thousands pass each day without a second glance, fate weaves an unexpected connection between a simple security guard and a child in need. Charles, a man familiar with silence and the ordinary rhythm of mall life, is suddenly thrust into a situation that tests his resolve and compassion. What begins as a routine shift soon spirals into an emotional journey of courage, kindness, and quiet heroism when he finds an abandoned baby. The story explores the transformation of an unlikely hero and the power of simple, genuine actions in the face of unexpected challenges. A tender bond forms, intertwining two lives from worlds apart. But as he discovers the baby's identity and faces the uncertainties of his own future, Charles learns that acts of kindness often lead to life-changing rewards. This story invites you to follow Charles's journey and witness how a single act can turn the tide of destiny. Follow along, subscribe, and let's embark on this heartfelt journey together. The night shift at the mall was often quiet, almost eerily so. Charles, a security guard in his late 40s, was used to this solitude, to the echo of his footsteps against the vast emptiness of the sprawling building. With little more than his flashlight and the occasional click of his radio, he spent each night walking the halls, a silent protector of a space that felt as abandoned as he sometimes did. That night began like any other, with Charles making his rounds, checking that doors were locked, lights were off, and the cleaning crew had left everything spotless. He enjoyed these hours of silence, a time to let his thoughts wander and unwind. Little did he know, though, that this shift would be unlike any other. As he passed the east wing, something caught his eye. Movement in the dim light, a small, shadowy figure huddled between two benches near the children's play area. His first instinct was to dismiss it as leftover trash or a misplaced doll. But then he heard it, a faint, whimpering cry. Charles's heart raced as he approached. There, nestled on a blanket and clutching a plush teddy bear, was a baby, a little boy no older than a few months, eyes wide with fear and confusion. The sight rooted Charles to the spot, his mind scrambling for an explanation. Who would leave a baby in a mall, alone and vulnerable? Swallowing his disbelief, he knelt down, his mind buzzing with questions. Was this a prank? A misunderstanding? But as he reached out and gently touched the child's tiny hand, he felt the reality of the situation. The baby's hand grasped his finger tightly, as if sensing his hesitancy, as if pleading for his help. "Hey there, little one," he murmured softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where's your mama?" The baby cooed in response, but his tiny whimpers tugged at something deep within Charles, a feeling he hadn't known in years, an instinct to protect. He glanced around, hoping to see anyone who might claim the child. But the mall was deserted, save for the distant hum of the central air system and the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead. "All right," Charles sighed. "I guess it's just you and me." He scooped the baby up, his large hands feeling awkward and clumsy as he tried to cradle the fragile body. The child squirmed but settled quickly, resting his head against Charles's chest. Charles felt his heart pounding as he carried the baby toward the security office, all the while mentally rehearsing what he'd say to his supervisor, to the authorities. Inside the small, cluttered office, he carefully placed the baby on the sofa, making sure he was comfortable. His own mind was racing with uncertainty. He knew he should call his boss or the police right away, but something held him back. This was a strange situation, and he wanted a moment to collect his thoughts, to gather the courage he needed to take the next step. The baby looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes, and Charles found himself mesmerized by them. He hadn't felt this connected to another soul in years, and a surge of protectiveness welled up within him, surprising even himself. "What do I do with you, kid?" he muttered, rubbing his hand over his face, feeling the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. As he debated his options, he was flooded with memories of his own childhood, long nights spent alone, wondering if anyone would come for him, if anyone would ever truly care. The loneliness he had felt then seemed to echo in this tiny child's gaze, and it was a feeling he could never wish on anyone else, least of all this innocent baby. It was then that he made a decision. Instead of calling right away, he would stay with the child, at least for the night. He'd ensure the baby was safe, fed, and cared for, even if it meant stretching the limits of his duties. His old thermos of coffee sat cold and forgotten on the desk, replaced by this new responsibility, this unexpected but undeniable bond. And so, with a deep breath, Charles settled in for a night that would be anything but ordinary, a night that would become the first chapter in a story he never saw coming. Charles had always considered himself a man of simplicity. His routines were set, his expectations low, and he rarely found himself out of his comfort zone. But as he watched over the tiny child nestled on the security office sofa, he felt a surge of unfamiliar feelings: fear, responsibility, and an overwhelming need to protect. The baby lay there peacefully, as if this odd little office, with its outdated desk and buzzing monitors, was the safest place in the world. Charles sat beside him, his gaze flickering between the baby and the clock on the wall, unsure of what to do next. The mall was closed, and calling the authorities so late at night seemed too disruptive. Plus, he couldn't shake the feeling that this baby needed him, if only for a few more hours. Charles's hand trembled slightly as he adjusted the blanket around the baby's tiny frame. He hadn't held a baby in years, if ever. The last time he'd been this close to such innocence had been in his childhood, a time marked by quiet struggles and a lonely resilience. This fragile little life had been abandoned, just as he had been so many years ago, and something deep inside him resonated with that experience. Just as he was lost in thought, the baby stirred and let out a soft whimper. Panic flashed across Charles's face, unsure of how to comfort him. He searched the room, finally spotting an old radio on the desk. He switched it on, tuning to a soft, mellow station that played quiet classical music. The baby's cries softened as he listened to the gentle notes, his little hands reaching out as if to grasp the melody floating through the air. Charles took a deep breath. "All right, buddy," he whispered. "It's just you and me tonight. Let's get you comfortable." Noticing the baby's hunger, he ventured out of the office, carefully locking the door behind him. He remembered a vending machine down the hallway that might have something useful. The mall was dark, each corner filled with looming shadows, but he moved with purpose, the weight of responsibility guiding him. Reaching the machine, he found a small bottle of water and some crackers. It wasn't much, but it would have to do until morning. Back in the office, he gently broke the crackers into tiny pieces and mixed them with a little water, creating a makeshift meal. To his relief, the baby accepted it eagerly, his tiny hands reaching out, clutching at the crumbs and water with innocent trust. Charles couldn't help but chuckle at the sight, feeling a surge of pride at this small success. As the night wore on, he watched over the child, cradling him in his arms whenever he grew restless. Memories flooded his mind, snippets of a childhood that had left him with scars, both visible and invisible. He remembered the nights he'd spent alone, the way the world had felt like a hostile place. It was a past he rarely confronted, but tonight, with this small child in his care, he felt as though he were facing it all over again, this time with a newfound strength. Hours passed, and dawn's first light began to filter through the office window. Charles felt a bittersweet sadness settling over him, knowing that his time with the child was drawing to a close. He would have to notify the authorities soon, to reunite the baby with whoever had left him here. But a part of him wanted to hold on to this moment, this sense of purpose that had filled him in ways he hadn't known were possible. As the baby finally drifted off into a deep sleep, Charles whispered, "You've got someone who cares now, little one, even if it's just for tonight." But deep down, he knew that this was more than just a fleeting moment. His life had taken an unexpected turn, and he couldn't help but wonder what tomorrow would bring. Morning crept into the office with soft sunlight filtering through the blinds, casting a warm glow across the room. Charles sat slumped in his chair, watching the baby stir as the first rays reached him. It had been a long night, but the feeling of exhaustion was softened by something else, a quiet contentment that was both foreign and comforting. The baby blinked awake, his tiny face scrunching up as he looked around, and then he focused on Charles. The sight brought a smile to Charles's face, a rare and genuine expression that even he hadn't felt in a long time. He reached over, gently brushing his hand over the child's soft hair. "Good morning, little guy," he whispered. "Looks like we made it through the night." But as he gazed at the baby, who responded with a soft coo and reached out a small hand toward him, a pang of sadness struck him. He knew he couldn't keep the child forever. Eventually, he'd have to call the authorities. Yet for these few moments, he let himself enjoy the simplicity of being here, of knowing he was someone's protector, even if only temporarily. He tried to guess what the baby's life might be like, who his parents were, what had led to this strange abandonment in the mall. Despite himself, Charles began to feel a connection to the child, a bond that felt strangely powerful. It wasn't just pity or a sense of duty, it was a recognition of something he himself had missed all his life. Someone who cared, someone who stayed. After rummaging through his locker, Charles found a clean t-shirt and used it as a makeshift blanket for the baby, wrapping him up snugly. He had also called in a favor with Janine, the coffee shop manager on the ground floor, asking her to bring him a small carton of milk and a soft muffin for the baby. She hadn't asked many questions, probably sensing Charles's need to keep things discreet, and had left the items by the back door as she opened up. As he fed the baby, a wave of memories washed over him. His childhood spent in foster care, the parade of faces that came and went, the well-meaning but transient guardians who had never stayed long enough for him to feel safe. He'd learned to rely on himself early, to detach and withdraw, to avoid disappointment. But now, with this baby in his arms, he couldn't help but feel that old shell beginning to crack. It was strange, almost frightening, how much this little life had begun to mean to him in just a few short hours. He found himself wondering what the baby would become, how he'd grow up, what dreams he'd chase. The thought left him feeling protective, determined to give the child a better beginning than he'd ever known, if only for this brief encounter. The morning hours passed quickly, and the weight of what he needed to do pressed on him. He had to call the mall director, inform him of the situation, and let the authorities take over. It was the right thing to do, he told himself, the responsible thing. But it felt more like a loss than anything else, like he was giving up a part of himself he hadn't known he still had. When the time came, Charles took a deep breath and dialed the mall director's number. As the phone rang, he held the baby close, his heart torn between doing what was right and holding on to this rare sense of connection. "Mr. Coleman?" he said when the director answered. "This is Charles from security. I have something important to report. It's about a baby I found last night in the mall. I think he's been abandoned." There was a long pause on the other end, and Charles could almost feel the director's shock. After a moment, Mr. Coleman responded, his voice sharp but controlled. "A baby? In the mall? Are you certain, Charles?" "Yes, sir. He's here with me now. I've taken care of him, but I believe we need to contact the authorities." Mr. Coleman's tone softened, a mix of concern and curiosity evident in his voice. "I'll be right there. Don't call anyone yet. I want to see this for myself." When the call ended, Charles was left with a mixture of relief and apprehension. He had done his part, taken the first step toward reuniting the child with his family. But as he held the baby one last time, he knew that this wouldn't be an easy goodbye. This innocent child had reached into a place in his heart he'd thought was long dormant, a part of him that had forgotten what it meant to love and to care. A few minutes later, Mr. Coleman arrived, his presence filling the small office. His eyes widened as he looked at the child nestled against Charles's chest, and a flicker of recognition passed over his face. "Oh my, that's my son!" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The shock in his expression quickly gave way to panic and then relief as he reached out, his hands trembling as he touched the child's tiny arm. Charles felt a surge of emotions, relief, sorrow, and an odd sense of pride. The baby was safe, finally back with his family. But as Mr. Coleman cradled his son, Charles knew that the connection he'd formed with the baby, however brief, had left an imprint on his heart. "Thank you, Charles," Mr. Coleman said, his voice thick with gratitude. "You don't know what this means to me. How can I ever repay you?" Charles only nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He watched as the director held his son, his heart aching with both joy and a quiet sadness. His night with the child had been unexpected, but it had given him a glimpse of something precious, a reminder of the connections we sometimes find in the most unlikely places. As Mr. Coleman left with his son, Charles sat alone in the office, the silence enveloping him once more. But it was different now, warmer, as if a light had been left behind in the darkness. And though the child was gone, Charles knew that the memory of that night would remain, a reminder of the impact of a single, selfless act. In the days following the baby's return to his father, Charles resumed his nightly routine at the mall. The silence that had once been a comfort to him now felt hollow, missing the faint sounds of the baby's breathing, the quiet coos, and the innocent gaze that had pierced his heart. He missed the warmth of that fleeting bond, yet he knew he had done the right thing. The baby was safe, back where he belonged, and Charles had returned to his solitary life. But just as he was settling back into his routine, he received an unexpected call from Mr. Coleman. The director's deep voice held a warmth Charles hadn't heard before. "Charles, would you come up to my office? There's something I'd like to discuss with you." Charles's mind raced with possibilities as he climbed the stairs to the director's office. Had he done something wrong? Perhaps there had been a complaint about his handling of the situation, or maybe there were formalities he'd overlooked. His palms grew clammy as he knocked on the door, his heart pounding in anticipation. "Come in," Mr. Coleman's voice called from inside. As Charles entered, he found Mr. Coleman seated at his desk, a serene expression on his face as he stood to greet him. To Charles's surprise, the baby was there as well, nestled in a small crib beside the desk, his tiny fingers clutching a blanket. The sight sent a rush of warmth through Charles, and he found himself smiling despite his nerves. "Thank you for coming, Charles," Mr. Coleman began, gesturing for him to sit. "I wanted to talk to you about that night. I still can't believe it, honestly. The thought of losing him, it's something I can't even imagine." Charles nodded, unsure of what to say. He hadn't expected Mr. Coleman to be so candid. In his mind, the director had always been a distant figure, someone who oversaw operations from afar. But now, sitting across from him, Charles could see the raw emotion in his eyes, a vulnerability he hadn't anticipated. "Charles," Mr. Coleman continued, his voice filled with sincerity, "I owe you more than just gratitude. You saved my son. You cared for him when he was most vulnerable, and I can't express how much that means to me." Charles looked down, his face flushed with embarrassment. "I just did what anyone would have done," he murmured. "He's a good kid, deserved to be safe." But Mr. Coleman shook his head. "Not everyone would have done what you did. You went above and beyond, Charles, and I think you've earned more than just my thanks." He paused, as if weighing his words. "I want to offer you something, a new position with more responsibility and stability, a place where you'll be able to grow, to have the security you deserve." Charles blinked, his mind reeling at the offer. A new position? Stability? It was more than he had ever hoped for. His life had been a string of temporary jobs, of moving from one place to the next without much direction. The idea of something lasting, something secure, was almost too much to believe. I don't know what to say," he stammered, glancing at the baby, who was now sleeping peacefully. The weight of the offer settled over him, filling him with a strange mixture of excitement and fear. Was he ready for this? Could he handle the responsibility? Seeing his hesitation, Mr. Coleman smiled kindly. "I understand if this is a lot to take in, but Charles, I've seen how you handled that night. You were calm, resourceful, compassionate. Those are qualities that I want on my team. And more than that, I want to give you the chance to have the kind of stability you may not have had before." Charles felt a lump form in his throat, emotions swirling as he tried to process the offer. The baby stirred in the crib, and Charles's gaze softened as he watched him. This child had changed his life in ways he couldn't have imagined. It was as if, through caring for him, Charles had found a new path, a way forward he hadn't thought possible. Taking a deep breath, Charles met Mr. Coleman's eyes and nodded. "Thank you, sir. I'd be honored." The director's face broke into a smile. "I'm glad to hear it, Charles. You've earned this." As they discussed the details of the new position, Charles couldn't help but glance over at the baby. He wondered if the child would ever know the impact he'd had on a lonely security guard, how a single night had reshaped his entire life. It was a quiet, unspoken bond, but one that Charles would carry with him always. When their conversation ended, Charles rose to leave, feeling a strange lightness in his step. As he approached the door, Mr. Coleman spoke up once more. "Oh, and Charles," he called out, "please feel free to visit anytime. I think my son might miss you if you don't." Charles turned back, a warmth spreading through him. "Thank you, sir. I'd like that." And as he left the office, he knew that his life had forever changed. He had found not just a purpose, but a connection, one that went beyond words, beyond duty. It was a bond that reminded him of the kindness that exists in unexpected places, the moments that define us in ways we can't predict. The transition to his new role was both exhilarating and overwhelming for Charles. As he settled into the responsibilities of his promotion, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into an entirely new chapter of his life. The position was a far cry from his old duties as a security guard. Now, he was tasked with overseeing mall operations, managing staff, and even contributing to decisions that impacted the entire complex. It was more responsibility than he had ever shouldered, but for the first time, Charles felt genuinely needed and respected. As the weeks went by, he found himself rising to the challenge. Mr. Coleman checked in frequently, often accompanied by his son, who had grown accustomed to Charles's presence and greeted him with joyful squeals. Each time Charles saw the child, he felt a swell of gratitude, a reminder of the night that had altered his life in more ways than he could count. But with this new position came a new set of challenges and decisions, some of which weighed heavily on him. One such decision presented itself in the form of a job offer from another mall in the city. The offer was tempting: higher pay, a title with even more responsibility, and the chance to start fresh in a new environment. For someone who had spent much of his life drifting from one job to another, the opportunity was both thrilling and terrifying. He spent several sleepless nights wrestling with the decision, torn between loyalty and ambition, comfort and change. The mall where he currently worked had become more than just a place of employment. It had become a home, a place filled with memories and connections he valued deeply. But the other offer dangled the promise of something greater, a chance to prove himself on a larger stage. One evening, as he sat alone in his office, the baby's face drifted into his thoughts, bringing with it a surge of clarity. The connection he had felt with the child, the quiet bond he'd formed that night in the security office, was something he could never replicate. Leaving this place would mean severing ties with the people who had given him a second chance, a family he hadn't known he needed. The next day, Charles approached Mr. Coleman's office with a sense of purpose. He'd made his decision, and he was ready to share it. As he knocked and entered, he found the director smiling at him, his son perched on his lap, babbling happily. "Charles, what a surprise! What brings you by?" Mr. Coleman asked, his eyes warm and welcoming. Charles took a deep breath, his gaze shifting to the baby, who reached out to him with a tiny hand. The sight steadied him, giving him the strength to speak. "Mr. Coleman, I wanted to thank you for everything. You gave me this opportunity, and it's changed my life in ways I never expected." Mr. Coleman's brow furrowed slightly, sensing the weight behind Charles's words. "It was well-deserved, Charles. You've been an asset to us, and I'm grateful to have you on the team." Charles nodded, feeling the gravity of his next words. "I've been offered a position at another mall. It's a good opportunity, one that would advance my career. But," he paused, searching for the right words. "But I realize that this place means more to me than just a job. It's where I found something I didn't know I was looking for. I want to stay here, if you'll have me." A warm smile spread across Mr. Coleman's face, and he extended a hand. "I couldn't be happier to hear that, Charles. We'd be lost without you." As they shook hands, the baby giggled, and Charles felt a sense of peace settle over him. The decision had been the right one. This place, these people, they were his family now. Later that evening, Charles wandered the mall after closing hours, his footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The silence, once lonely, now felt welcoming, a reminder of the journey he'd taken. He passed by the security office, his old haunt, and paused, remembering the night he'd found the baby, the night that had changed everything. He lingered there, smiling to himself, before finally turning to leave. As he walked away, he felt the weight of his past lift, replaced by a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. He was no longer the man who drifted. He was Charles, a part of something larger, something meaningful. His life had found its anchor, not in ambition or titles, but in the connections he had forged, the lives he had touched. And as he locked up the mall one last time that evening, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. The following weeks passed in a steady rhythm as Charles settled comfortably into his new role, managing the bustling mall with a confidence that surprised even him. His days were full, filled with meetings, scheduling, and endless tasks. Yet despite the demands of his job, he still found time to visit Mr. Coleman's office, catching glimpses of the baby whose presence had so profoundly altered his life. One chilly afternoon, as Charles was overseeing the setup of a seasonal display, he noticed Mr. Coleman and his son strolling through the mall. Mr. Coleman gave him a wave, a warm smile breaking across his face as he approached with the baby in his arms. "Charles, good to see you out here," Mr. Coleman greeted him. "We were just grabbing a quick lunch and thought we'd take a stroll." Charles felt his heart lighten at the sight of the baby, who had grown visibly over the past weeks. The child's face lit up as he recognized Charles, reaching his tiny hands out as if to say hello. Charles reached out, giving the baby's hand a gentle squeeze, feeling that familiar sense of connection wash over him once more. "He's getting big," Charles remarked, a smile softening his face. "Hard to believe he's the same little guy I found that night." Mr. Coleman's expression grew serious, and he nodded. "Charles, I've been meaning to tell you. I haven't forgotten what you did for us. My wife and I talk about it often. I can't thank you enough." Charles shrugged modestly, but Mr. Coleman continued. "It's more than just gratitude, though. I'd like to ask you something. My wife and I have talked it over, and we'd like to invite you to spend more time with our son, as his godfather if you're open to it." Charles felt the words hit him like a wave, filling him with emotions he couldn't quite name. "His godfather?" he repeated, barely believing what he'd heard. The thought of being entrusted with such a role, such a responsibility, was overwhelming. Mr. Coleman nodded. "You were there for him when he needed it most, Charles, and in the time since, you've been a part of his life, a steady presence. We'd be honored to have you take on this role. If it's something you'd like, of course." Charles swallowed, feeling a tightness in his chest as he looked at the baby. This child, who had entered his life so unexpectedly, had given him something he never dreamed he'd have, a family. It was a chance to be part of something, to be important to someone, to leave a legacy of kindness and compassion. After a moment, he looked back at Mr. Coleman, his voice thick with emotion. "I'd be honored," he said quietly. "Truly honored." The baby gurgled happily, as if in agreement, and Charles felt a profound joy settle over him. His life had changed in unimaginable ways, and he knew that this was only the beginning of a bond that would last a lifetime. As the days went by, Charles found himself spending more time with the baby, visiting Mr. Coleman's family for dinners, helping with babysitting, and even learning the subtle art of calming the child's cries. In moments like these, he felt a warmth that reached deeper than any career achievement or personal milestone. It was a fulfillment he hadn't known was possible, a role he hadn't realized he was searching for. He watched the baby grow, marking milestones and sharing in the laughter and joy of watching a child's world unfold. And as the seasons passed, Charles's connection to Mr. Coleman's family only deepened. He was no longer just a security guard or a mall manager. He was someone's godfather, someone's family, bound by a night he would never forget. Through it all, he remained grateful for the chance to love and to be loved in return, to find purpose in the most unexpected place. The night he'd found the baby had indeed changed everything, leaving a mark on his heart that would stay with him forever. Months passed, and Charles's role as both a mall manager and a godfather brought him a deep sense of fulfillment he hadn't known in years. He had fallen into a rhythm, one that balanced his responsibilities at work with the moments he cherished as part of Mr. Coleman's family. His connection with the baby, whom he now called Max, grew stronger by the day, and Charles found himself stepping naturally into the role of a guiding presence in the child's life. One brisk autumn day, Charles was in the middle of overseeing preparations for the upcoming holiday season when he was called to Mr. Coleman's office. His heart skipped a beat, a mixture of anticipation and curiosity filling him as he made his way to the office. Over the months, he'd come to respect Mr. Coleman not only as his boss, but as a friend, and he wondered what could be so urgent. When he entered the office, he was greeted by Mr. Coleman, his wife Sarah, and Max, who clapped his chubby hands in delight upon seeing Charles. Mr. Coleman gestured for him to sit, a broad smile on his face that hinted at something special. "Charles, we've been talking," Mr. Coleman began, glancing at Sarah, who nodded warmly. "You've become an invaluable part of our lives, both at work and personally. We can't thank you enough for everything you've done for us, especially for Max." Charles felt a blush creep up his cheeks. "I'm just grateful to be part of it," he said sincerely, feeling a sense of pride swell within him. Mr. Coleman leaned forward, his tone turning serious, yet affectionate. "We know you've been happy in your role here, but we'd like to do something more for you, a way of saying thank you for everything you've done. So, we've decided to offer you a partnership in the mall's operations." Charles blinked, stunned into silence. Partnership?" he managed, his voice barely a whisper. The thought was overwhelming, beyond anything he'd ever imagined. This was more than a promotion or a simple show of appreciation. It was an invitation into a future he hadn't dared dream of. Mr. Coleman nodded, a pleased look in his eyes. "Yes, a share in the business, a place on the board, and the opportunity to shape the future of the mall. You've more than proven your dedication and capability, and we believe you're the perfect person to help us lead." Charles felt his hands shake as he processed the offer. His past flashed through his mind, a life filled with uncertainty, drifting from job to job, always feeling like an outsider. Now, here he was, being offered a partnership, a stake in something that had become a central part of his life. It was a dream come true, but it was also more than that. It was a validation of his worth, a recognition of the man he had worked hard to become. "Mr. Coleman, Sarah, I don't know what to say," Charles stammered, his voice thick with emotion. "This is beyond anything I could have imagined." Sarah reached over, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "Charles, you're family to us, and family takes care of each other. You've been there for Max, for all of us, in ways we'll never forget. This is our way of making sure you know just how much you mean to us." As Charles looked at their faces, he felt a warmth settle over him, a sense of belonging that went beyond words. "I'd be honored," he finally replied, his voice steady despite the emotions swirling within him. "Thank you for this incredible opportunity. I won't let you down." As they embraced, Max clapped his hands, babbling in delight, as if sensing the significance of the moment. Charles looked down at the child, feeling a swell of gratitude for the chain of events that had led him here. That one fateful night had opened doors he hadn't known existed, had given him a family, a purpose, and a future he'd thought was out of reach. Over the next few weeks, Charles began his new responsibilities as a partner, diving into meetings and discussions that shaped the mall's operations. With every decision he made, he kept in mind the people who shopped and worked in the mall, as well as the family that had given him this chance. His life had taken on a new sense of meaning, one that extended beyond himself. Yet despite the demands of his new role, he continued to visit Mr. Coleman's office frequently, spending time with Max and watching him grow. He treasured each moment, aware that these were the memories that would carry him through any challenge, and the moments that grounded him and reminded him of the journey he'd traveled. Charles's journey was far from over, but he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be, surrounded by people who cared, making a difference in ways he'd never dreamed possible. And as he looked toward the future, he did so with a heart full of gratitude and a resolve to honor the gift he'd been given. With his partnership solidified, Charles felt as if he had entered a new chapter of his life, one that was filled with purpose, gratitude, and an unshakable commitment to the people he had come to call family. Each morning, he walked through the mall with a renewed sense of pride, greeting shop owners, mall employees, and visitors, feeling an integral part of the place he once guarded in the quiet of night. But while his role was busier than ever, Charles still carved out time for what mattered most: Max. His bond with the child had only grown stronger, and he cherished every moment he spent with him, teaching him small things, like how to clap to the beat of music or offering him new toys that made Max giggle with delight. Their relationship was a reminder of the path Charles had walked, a journey from solitude to connection, from loneliness to family. One brisk evening, Charles was invited to Mr. Coleman's house for dinner, a rare opportunity for him to see his godson outside the bustling mall. He arrived bearing a small stuffed bear he'd picked up at a toy shop, and Max's face lit up as soon as he saw it. Mr. Coleman greeted him with a warm handshake, and Sarah enveloped him in a hug, making Charles feel immediately at home. Dinner was filled with laughter, stories, and warm camaraderie. Charles marveled at how natural it felt to sit at the Coleman family's dining table, sharing a meal and basking in the glow of genuine friendship. Max sat in his high chair, chattering away in baby babble that brought smiles to everyone's faces. Charles found himself watching the child with quiet affection, feeling both pride and wonder at how much Max had grown. After dinner, as they gathered in the living room, Sarah excused herself to put Max to bed. Charles watched her go, a wistful smile on his face as he saw the tender bond between mother and child. Once they were alone, Mr. Coleman leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Charles, I want you to know something," he began, his tone sincere. "The night you found Max changed everything for me. I can't tell you how grateful I am. You didn't just save my son, you reminded me of the importance of the people around us, the connections that make life worth living." Charles felt a wave of humility wash over him. "It was fate, I think," he replied softly. "Finding Max that night gave me something I didn't even know I was missing. It gave me purpose." Mr. Coleman nodded. "That's exactly it. And that's why Sarah and I have been talking. You're more than just a godfather to Max. You're part of our family. We'd like to make it official." Charles blinked, processing the words with a mixture of disbelief and emotion. "Official?" he echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Mr. Coleman replied. "We'd like to name you as Max's legal guardian should anything ever happen to us. It's not something we like to think about, but knowing Max would have you, well, that brings us a lot of comfort." The words struck Charles with the force of a tidal wave, leaving him speechless. The weight of the offer, the trust, the love, was overwhelming. His heart swelled with a mixture of joy and humility, and he took a deep breath, meeting Mr. Coleman's gaze with steady eyes. "I'd be honored," Charles said, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't imagine anything more meaningful." Mr. Coleman smiled, a look of relief and gratitude filling his face. "Thank you, Charles. We know Max will be in good hands." At that moment, Sarah returned, carrying a drowsy Max who had just fallen asleep. She gently placed him in Charles's arms, and Charles felt a deep sense of peace as he held the sleeping child close. Max's tiny hand rested against his chest, and Charles knew that he would do anything to protect him, to give him the love and security he himself had once longed for. The night air was crisp when he left the Coleman house, and as he walked home, he felt as though he were stepping into a new world, a world where he was loved, trusted, and part of something far greater than himself. In the weeks that followed, Charles continued to embrace his role in Max's life. He joined the Colemans for family outings, became a familiar face at their gatherings, and even helped Sarah with small parenting tasks. His life had become richer, filled with laughter, purpose, and a joy he hadn't thought possible. Every day, he carried the memory of that fateful night in the mall, the night that had set his life on a new path. It was a reminder of how one act of kindness, one moment of connection, could change the course of an entire life. The holidays arrived with the mall bustling in a frenzy of decorations, gift displays, and holiday music filling every corner. For the first time in years, Charles looked forward to the season, not because of the festivities around him, but because of the sense of belonging he now felt. He spent his days managing the mall's holiday events and his evenings with the Colemans, helping them prepare for Christmas, wrapping presents with Sarah, and listening to Mr. Coleman's stories of his own childhood holiday traditions. Max had become the center of his world. The child's laughter, his unsteady first steps, and his curious gaze brought an irreplaceable joy into Charles's life. Watching Max grow and explore made every challenge, every struggle, feel worthwhile. Charles found himself at peace, feeling that he'd finally discovered his place in the world, surrounded by a family that had chosen him as much as he had chosen them. On Christmas Eve, the Colemans invited Charles over for a quiet family gathering. He arrived with a small gift he'd carefully chosen for Max, a handcrafted wooden toy truck. As soon as he entered, Max, who had recently learned to toddle around, ran straight to him, giggling as he reached up to be lifted into Charles's arms. Charles couldn't help but feel a swell of pride as he swung Max up, laughing along with the child's delighted squeals. They gathered around the tree, which sparkled with ornaments and twinkling lights. creating a warm glow that filled the room. Charles looked around, taking in the scene. Mr. Coleman setting up a tray of cocoa, Sarah arranging presents under the tree, and Max clutching his new toy truck with wide-eyed wonder. It was a scene he had never experienced in his own childhood, a holiday spent surrounded by love and laughter. Sarah handed Charles a small, wrapped box, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "We got something for you, Charles," she said, urging him to open it. Charles carefully unwrapped the gift, revealing a framed photo of him with Max, taken during a recent family outing. In the photo, Max was perched on Charles's shoulders, his small hands clutching Charles's hair, both of them laughing. The frame was engraved with a simple phrase: "Family is where the heart finds its home." Charles felt his throat tighten, emotions welling up as he looked at the image, at the words that captured the bond he'd come to cherish so deeply. He looked up, his voice unsteady. "Thank you. I don't think I could have asked for anything more meaningful." Sarah and Mr. Coleman exchanged a warm smile, and Mr. Coleman clapped Charles on the back. "You're part of this family, Charles. Don't ever forget that." The evening continued with stories, laughter, and the soft glow of the holiday lights illuminating the room. Charles felt as though he were living in a dream, surrounded by the love and warmth he'd yearned for his entire life. Holding Max close as the child drifted off to sleep, Charles knew that he had found a family that went beyond blood, a connection built on shared moments and quiet acts of kindness. A few days later, as the new year approached, Charles was walking through the mall when he spotted an elderly woman sitting on a bench, clutching a small bag with trembling hands. Her face was lined with worry, her eyes darting nervously around. Charles approached her gently, sensing that something was wrong. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said softly, kneeling down to meet her gaze. "Is everything all right? Can I help you with something?" The woman's eyes filled with relief, and she nodded, explaining that she had lost her wallet and was unsure of how to get home. Charles listened patiently, offering her a kind smile as he reassured her. He took the time to help her find the assistance she needed, making sure she was taken care of before continuing his rounds. As he walked away, Charles reflected on how much his life had changed. The man he had once been, a solitary figure with little connection to others, felt like a distant memory. He had been transformed by the simple act of kindness that night he found Max, an act that had opened his heart and allowed him to give back to those around him. Each day, he found new ways to pay forward the kindness that had come into his life. He took time with the mall's employees, checked in on elderly patrons, and even organized a small fund to help families in need. It was as though he were trying to share the light that had been given to him, spreading it wherever he went. As the new year began, Charles knew that he was no longer just a man with a job. He was part of a community, part of a family, and his life had been shaped by the love and generosity he had both given and received. His bond with the Colemans and his godson Max was unbreakable, a reminder of the strength that lies in human connection. Standing at the entrance of the mall one morning, watching families walk by, children laughing, and couples sharing quiet conversations, Charles felt a peace he had never known. His journey was far from over, but he faced each day with a heart full of gratitude and a purpose that extended beyond himself. Life had given him a second chance, a chance to be someone's hero, to make a difference, to find a family that was built on love and trust. And as he looked toward the future, Charles knew that he would carry this gift with him always, a reminder that even the smallest act of kindness could change the world. A year had passed since that fateful night in the mall when Charles found Max, and life had settled into a steady rhythm of work, family, and quiet moments of gratitude. Charles had never imagined that a single encounter could so profoundly alter the course of his life, yet here he was, fulfilled, content, and with a sense of purpose he hadn't known he was missing. One cool autumn afternoon, Charles was sitting in the Colemans' living room, watching Max play with a stack of colorful blocks. Max had grown so much, his laughter filling the room as he toppled his tower and eagerly began to build it back up. Sarah and Mr. Coleman were nearby, preparing snacks in the kitchen, while Charles kept an eye on Max, smiling at the pure joy radiating from the child. As he watched Max play, a soft knock came at the door. Mr. Coleman opened it, and in walked an unfamiliar couple, Well-dressed, a bit formal, their expressions a mixture of nervousness and excitement. Sarah looked up, surprise and then recognition lighting up her face. Charles felt a strange anticipation as the visitors introduced themselves and shared their connection with the Colemans. "Charles," Mr. Coleman said, gesturing for him to come over, "these are old friends of ours. They reached out to us recently, looking for a home for a foster child who they think would thrive in a family like ours." Charles's breath caught as the couple explained, with quiet earnestness, their experiences in fostering. They had cared for many children over the years, giving them temporary homes, helping them find permanent placements. And now, they were looking to place a 10-year-old boy who needed stability, compassion, and guidance. The couple looked at Charles thoughtfully. "Mr. Coleman told us a bit about your story," the woman said gently. "We've seen how you've been part of this family, how much love and care you've given to Max. We thought perhaps you'd be open to fostering a child who needs the same." Charles was speechless, his mind racing as he took in the gravity of their offer. The idea of fostering a child, of giving another person the chance to find what he had found, felt both overwhelming and exhilarating. He looked at Mr. Coleman, who nodded with a soft, encouraging smile, and then at Sarah, whose expression was filled with warmth and support. "Yes," he finally managed, his voice filled with conviction. "I'd be honored to meet him." A week later, Charles found himself nervously pacing his apartment, straightening up and double-checking every small detail in anticipation of meeting the boy. His mind was a whirlwind of excitement and self-doubt. Would he be enough? Could he provide the love and stability this child needed? At last, a soft knock at the door signaled the boy's arrival. Charles took a steadying breath and opened it to find the couple standing with a young boy who looked up at him with wide, guarded eyes. The boy was small for his age, with tousled brown hair and a shy expression that reminded Charles of himself at that age, quiet, uncertain, and cautious of the world. "Hey there," Charles said gently, crouching down to meet the boy's gaze. "My name's Charles. It's really nice to meet you." The boy nodded, his gaze flickering with both curiosity and apprehension. "Hi," he mumbled softly, shifting his weight nervously. Over the next hour, Charles and the boy, whose name was Liam, talked in soft, tentative tones, sharing small details about themselves. Charles spoke of his own childhood, how he had grown up without a stable family, and how, just like Liam, he had once felt lost and unsure. As he spoke, he watched Liam's expression shift, the guardedness easing bit by bit as he realized he was talking to someone who truly understood. They spent the afternoon together, playing games, building model planes, and sharing stories. By the end of the day, Liam seemed more comfortable, his laughter filling the apartment with a lightness that touched Charles's heart. When it was time for Liam to leave, he looked up at Charles with a shy smile. "Can I come back sometime?" he asked, his voice filled with hope. Charles's heart swelled as he knelt down, placing a comforting hand on Liam's shoulder. "You're always welcome here, Liam. This is your home too if you want it to be." Over the next few months, Liam became a regular presence in Charles's life, slowly adjusting to the idea of stability and trust. Together, they forged a bond that went beyond words, rooted in mutual understanding and a shared past of loneliness that now felt like a distant memory. Charles took pride in guiding Liam, in being the anchor he had once longed for in his own life. With each passing day, Charles grew to see Liam as part of his family, a piece of his heart that he hadn't known was missing. He introduced Liam to Mr. Coleman, Sarah, and Max, who eagerly embraced the new addition to their extended family. And for the first time, Charles felt his life come full circle. On a crisp winter evening, as they sat by the fireplace in his apartment, Charles looked over at Liam, who was dozing off with Max's toy truck clutched in his hand. The boy's expression was peaceful, a look of contentment that filled Charles with a deep sense of accomplishment and joy. This was what life was about, he realized. Not the titles, the jobs, or the endless search for purpose. It was the connections, the simple moments of love and trust that gave life meaning. As he looked down at Liam, Charles felt an overwhelming gratitude for the journey he had taken, a journey that had started with a single act of kindness in the quiet of a deserted mall. Life had come full circle, and Charles knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be, surrounded by love, purpose, and family. He leaned back, content and at peace, knowing that he had found the home he had always been searching for. And as the fire crackled softly, Charles closed his eyes, embracing the warmth of a life filled with meaning, a life that had finally, beautifully come full circle.